When we think of the fall of Rome, the same scenes usually come to mind. Barbarians at the gates, dissolving legions, emperors poisoned in their palaces. But an empire does not fall solely because of attacks from the outside. It collapses from within. And the thing that rots the inside fastest is often money. Rome fell for precisely this reason, not just because of invasions or corruption, but because its currency collapsed. And the lessons told by this collapse remain valid for modern economies that believe they can do whatever they want with money. So, let's set the scene from the beginning. For centuries, Rome's economic backbone was the silver denarius. When it was first minted around 211 BC, it was nearly pure silver. Soldiers received their wages based on this. Merchants demanded this money, and people stored their wealth in this currency. The denarius was not just money. It was essentially a tangible sense of trust. The power of the empire and the value of this currency were tightly bound to one another. As long as people believed in Rome, they believed in the denarius. But maintaining an empire is incredibly expensive. Armies demand wages, roads and aqueducts must be built, and wars need to be financed. By the 2nd century AD, Rome was under pressure from all fronts: the Parthians in the east, Germanic tribes in the north, and unrest from within. Expenses were rising incessantly, and tax revenues could not keep up. Consequently, the emperors resorted to a very old method: debasement, that is, reducing the precious metal content within the currency. Demanding more taxes would have angered the populace. Instead, they decided to mint money that looked the same but was worth less. The figures tell this story very clearly. During the reign of Augustus, a denarius was approximately 95% silver. By the time of Caracalla in the early 3rd century, this ratio had dropped to 50%. By the mid-3rd century, under Gallienus, the denarius had become almost entirely bronze. The silver content was below even 5%. In other words, the currency, which was once minted from nearly pure metal, consisted now of nothing more than a silver wash lightly applied over a cheap bronze disc. The public felt this. As money was devalued, inflation rose, because money was no longer based on real value. A measure of wheat that once cost 1 denarius soon began to cost tens of denarii. This was not a theoretical issue. It was a concrete situation that ruined people's lives. Soldiers demanded higher wages because they could not make ends meet. Merchants began to refuse the devalued currency. Instead, they demanded gold or direct barter. Local parts of the economy reverted to barter because no one trusted the money. As trust diminished, emperors thought they could solve the problem by minting even more worthless money. But they only fed the vicious cycle. This process reached its peak during the crisis of the 3rd century. Between 235 and 284 AD, Rome experienced total chaos for nearly 50 years: invasions, plagues, civil wars, and economic collapse. Emperors ascended the throne and were killed within a few months, with new ones following in succession. However, behind this political turmoil lay the real problem: a collapsed financial system. Taxes were demanded in increasingly worthless currency. When farmers realized they could not pay their taxes with this money, they abandoned their lands. Trade networks shattered. The Roman government resorted to desperate measures such as price controls and forced labor obligations to keep the system afloat, but none of it worked. Emperor Diocletian made a major move to fix the situation. In 301 AD, he issued the Edict on Maximum Prices. This edict imposed price limits on more than 1,000 goods and services, from grain to labor wages. The penalty for violating the law was death, But you cannot forcibly fix prices when money is worthless. This experiment resulted in total disaster. The black market exploded, and official trade collapsed. People soon realized a law cannot make devalued money valuable again. Eventually, Rome abandoned the denarius entirely. Around 312 AD, Constantine the Great minted a gold coin of constant purity called the solidus. This currency provided stability in the Byzantine Empire for centuries, but by that time Western Rome had already been irreversibly weakened. The debasement of the denarius had rotted Rome's economic foundation from the inside out. It could not maintain the army, it could not sustain trade, and it could not win the trust of the people. The fall of Rome was not a single event. It was a long process of dissolution. And one of the strongest threads of this dissolution was the collapse of the currency. So, what should we take from this story for today? It is very simple. Destroying money destroys empires. Rome thought it could fool the public, that it could mint coins that were hollowed out but looked the same on the outside. Today's governments think the same thing. They believe that by printing money, playing with interest rates, and melting debt away through inflation, everything will be fine. But the result is always the same. The people pay the price, wealth vanishes, and trust collapses. Whatever the lesson Rome experienced back then, it is still valid today. Throughout history, in every major inflation crisis, the same thing has been repeated. States steal value from the money, the privileged class protects itself with real assets, and ordinary people foot the bill. Rome's currency crisis is the first major example of this, a template for collapse. When we came to the 20th century, this pattern continued exactly as before. After World War I, when Germany could not cope with the heavy reparations of the Treaty of Versailles, it began to print money. Just like Rome, it thought it could simply cover the debt with new money. But by 1923, inflation spun out of control. A loaf of bread that cost 1 mark before the war had become 200 billion marks by autumn. People had to carry their wages in wheelbarrows. Retirees who had saved for a lifetime lost everything in an instant. Those with debts were freed of their burdens by inflation, but those holding factories, land, gold, or foreign currency became even more powerful. As money became meaningless, the country swung to political extremes, and this environment paved the way for the rise of Hitler. Zimbabwe followed the same path in the 2000s, with declining production, rising debts, and forced land seizures. The government began printing money. In 2008, inflation reached 89.7 sextillion percent per year. Prices were doubling almost every day. Shops could not keep up with changing the price tags. Eventually, Zimbabwe completely abandoned its own currency and switched to the US dollar and the South African rand. Once again, a government thought it could cheat reality. Once again, the people paid. But we don't even need to look at extreme examples. Even in developed countries, the same pattern is playing out. In the United States in 1971, President Richard Nixon completely severed the dollar from the gold standard. Thus, the dollar became fiat money, based entirely on trust with no tangible value behind it. From that moment on, it became much easier for governments to spend more than necessary. Debts grew, the money supply grew, and inflation always made itself felt in the background. Today, to buy what you bought for $1 in 1971, you spend $6. The banknotes are the same, the coins are the same, but the value is very different. Money, even if it looks the same on the surface, has been hollowed out from the inside. What makes this situation even more dangerous is that the whole world is now in the same system. Rome's fall was the fall of an empire. Weimar Germany's hyperinflation was national. Zimbabwe's was local. But today, the entire world runs on fiat money, huge debts, and central banks ready to print trillions in a crisis. This means that the next major crash will not be limited to just one country. It will affect the whole world. And as always, those who will suffer the most will be salaried employees, retirees, and ordinary people who save. Therefore, as individuals, there are three fundamental lessons we can learn from Rome's currency crisis. 1. Inflation is not an accident, it is a policy. It is a silent tax that has been eating empires from the inside for 2,000 years. 2. Real wealth is not in paper money. It is in assets that remain standing even when money becomes worthless. Land, skills, production, real resources. 3. Never take stability for granted. If first-century Romans had heard that their money would one day become nearly worthless, they would have laughed. If Germans in 1913 heard they would have to carry wheelbarrows full of cash, they would have mocked the idea. Zimbabweans in the 1980s believed independence would bring economic prosperity, but they all faced the same end. The fall of Rome tells us this: financial systems collapse first gradually, then suddenly. When money loses its reality, society begins to dissolve as well. Contracts are broken, trade stops, armies scatter, and governments lose their legitimacy. The barbarians at the gates only deal the final blow. The real collapse begins in the treasury. And here is the bitter but true part. History may not repeat itself exactly, but if you do not understand it, it will crush you. Rome's currency crisis was not just about bad emperors or greedy elites. It was about how fragile money is when abused by power, and that fragility is still with us.